Hi, welcome back to Health Through Freedom. Now, this channel strives to help people's health by trying to improve their emotional well-being or emotional freedom. Speaking about freedom, I'm going to interview Dorothy Mendez, the Reach Coordinator of A21 in the UK. Now, what is A21? A21 is a well-known organization that strives to combat slavery and human trafficking. So stay put, because you'll not only hear about the monstrosity of human trafficking itself, but you'll also hear about how so many have been rescued and also how you as a human being can help out. Hi, Dorothy. Welcome here.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me, Ruth. It's so good to be here.
It's great to have you here today, and especially, speaking about such an important theme. Now, when we talk about slavery and human trafficking, is this really a reality in today's times?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think for so many people, when we think about the idea of slavery, we're like, oh, wasn't that abolished years ago? Like, what are you talking about? People are not walking around in chains as such. But the reality is that it's estimated nearly 50 million people are enslaved in the world today. And that slavery can look different. And we often say that it is the crime that is hidden in plain sight. And more times than not, we're not aware of it because it could be somebody that we pass on our way to the tube or to the subway or on our way to work. And
Right.
the thing is that modern day slavery, or we can use the term human trafficking, it is basically the force, the use of somebody that's being controlled or manipulated for their body, for their labor. So that could look like sexual exploitation, that could look like forced labor, that can sometimes look like domestic servitude. In certain countries, that looks like child soldiers. There's so many different ways and shapes that human trafficking and modern day slavery are existing in our modern world. And a lot of times it is the control that another person, the trafficker, has over this human for the purpose of exploitation.
Okay. Is there any gender that's most affected by human trafficking?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about human trafficking is that it impacts all people across all age groups, all demographics, women and children, as well as men. Oftentimes, though, we do kind of have this image in our head that potentially, when you think of human trafficking, you might think of sex trafficking or sex workers. And potentially you're thinking, oh, that's just happening in the developing world, or that's just being targeted towards women. But the reality is that it impacts all types of people, because
Right.
as humans, we all have one thing in common, and that's vulnerability. And any one of us can be vulnerable and susceptible to the allure or the coercion or the manipulation of another person. And when you're in a position of like need or stress, or again, those compounded vulnerabilities, it's easier to fall into those traps unconsciously. Again, I guess I kind of just want to reiterate, I don't think anybody grows up one day and thinks, oh my gosh, when I'm older, I want to be taken advantage of and exploited for my body. Like, I don't think we have those dreams or aspirations. More times than not, it's desperation that leads someone to that situation.
Right.
But overall, statistically, of that 50 million people that I mentioned, it's recorded that 1 out of every 4 of those people are often women or children, especially children, 1 out of 4. And so there is, in the general, and when we're talking about statistics, this is it's often targeted, I guess, against people who are more vulnerable. So young children tend to have that vulnerability, that innocence. But like, for example, I'm located here in the UK, and so we work across different counties, across different countries, and we've seen that the highest group of people who are impacted by human trafficking and modern day slavery, 80% are actually male, and the highest form of trafficking that's taking place is forced labor. So depending on which country you're in, it can impact a certain group differently. So that's one thing that's really important, I guess, for us to be aware of, that it's happening all over, and it's happening to so many different types of people.
Right. And Dorothy, can you just give an example of how one can really get trapped into a situation of human slavery or human trafficking?
Yeah, absolutely. So early on when I started in our organization, I actually, before I was working with A21, I heard our founder, her name is Christine Kane, she was speaking at a conference. And so this was probably the first time I kind of had heard about modern day slavery or human trafficking. This was nearly 12 years ago. So it was still something that was quite a current event. It wasn't very common. Perhaps you've watched the movie Taken. That was kind of like my introduction into that world. And for a lot of people, and myself including, it was so harrowing. It was so impacting because I had no idea. And I heard this story, and I'll tell you the story of this young girl. Her name is Laura. And sadly, Laura, she was 13 years old when she was sold by her family to a trafficker. And so statistics tell us that the majority of cases that a victim of human trafficking actually knows their trafficker. They might be a family friend, they might even be a relative, or they might be a friend of a friend. And so this goes to show us that this is happening in a very proximate way. It's usually taking place over a long period of time. There's a little bit of this grooming process or this, trying to build up trust so that somebody thinks that there's good intentions. And so in Laura's situation, you can imagine she's 13 years old, completely vulnerable. You would never imagine in your wildest dreams to be sold into a situation by your family. And she's taken to a foreign country where she doesn't speak the language, and she is abused, and she is, controlled. And then sadly, one day, she is taken by this trafficker and abandoned on the street, left to fend for her own. So now she's in this situation, like I already said, so vulnerable, doesn't have the language, doesn't have a support system, has been taken to another country, and now she's been abandoned after being abused, and she's completely susceptible, right? And so on this particular occasion, there was a group of men that approached Laura, and they saw that she was really upset. She was crying, she was alone. For me, I couldn't get past the fact that she's 13 years old, like so young to be in a situation when you're left on your own, let alone in a situation where you have to try to figure out how to survive. And this group of men approached her and asked her, like, is she okay? What had happened to her? They could clearly see that she was under some sort of duress. And so Laura, in that moment of vulnerability, told this group of men everything that had happened to her. She told them that she had been sold by her family, that she had been taken to another country, she didn't really speak the language, that she had been like abused and mistreated, and now she's been abandoned and has no place to go and has no way of surviving. And they heard this story, and like most people, were so horrified by the reality of these different things that had taken place. And so they said to her, Laura, come with us. We'll find a place for you to stay. We'll get a warm, meal for you to eat, a roof over your head, and we'll help you figure out your next steps. So essentially, she went with this group, and that evening, everything happened like what they said. She had a place to stay, a safe roof over her head, a bed to sleep in. She had a meal. She went to sleep that night. She woke up the next day and nothing had happened. And, there's that moment of relief. However, it wasn't until the following day that that same group of men returned, and they said to her, you know what, Laura? We know you're young, but we think it would be really helpful for you in your situation if you started working. And so we have this contact in a neighboring town where you can start working, making a little bit of money for yourself so you can gain a little bit of independence and get back on your feet, essentially. And so she heard this. And like anybody, right? You're in a situation, you can imagine.
So vulnerable.
You're so vulnerable. And so she went with this group of men, agreed to all the things that they had said. And sadly, it was in that neighboring town where the exploitation started, where Laura was literally chained to a radiator, where she was forced to service men, different clients. She wasn't able to come and go as she pleased. Now, what's really significant about this story and what I heard, and I heard this the first time, You know, you and I can hear this, and it's very gut-wrenching and it's very harrowing. What's so remarkable is, though, that there was a neighbor that lived close by within this apartment complex, and she noticed a couple different things. First of all, she noticed that there was different groups of people coming and going at all hours of the day, you know, early morning, late at night. She also noticed that Laura had been taken to this apartment, but she'd never come out again. And so she, essentially this neighbor, you know, she noticed all these things and thought, this just doesn't seem right. So she called the authorities and said exactly that. She first of all said, I'm not an expert, I'm not claiming to know everything, but I've noticed these different things that just don't sit right with me. And she left it with them. So she told them that she saw this young girl, but has never seen her again. Surely she should be in school. Like, this just doesn't seem right. Also, people from all different age groups, men are coming in and out of this apartment. This also seems a bit fishy. And so sure enough, you know, an investigation was launched. There was enough information for them to go in to this apartment and thankfully rescue Laura. And then Laura was then to our care with A21. Like you mentioned earlier, we work not only in the rehabilitation side of things, but we also work in the safeguarding and rescuing side, as well as prevention, education, and awareness. And so our team was able to support her through that. But here's an example. Somebody is being taken advantage of for their vulnerability. It wasn't her own choosing. She found herself in a situation out of her control, you know, and in more cases than not, like I said, the trafficker could be somebody that you trust or somebody that's known or a friend of a friend. And so you can innocently think, oh, this is a great job opportunity, or this is a great work abroad opportunity, or study abroad. And then you find yourself in a situation where you're either being, you know, physically abused or psychologically, emotionally entrapped, and you cannot escape.
Right, and really, it just tells me how much we should be aware of. You know, it's so easy to just go on the street and not look and not have any clue of what's going on with the human beings that are around us. So, is there any? Can you tell us? Is there any signs? Are there any signs that can help us? You know, understand as indicators that someone is being held captive or against their will.
Absolutely. So in Laura's situation, this is a perfect example where there's often multiple signs. There's usually more than one indicator. In an isolated event, some of these indicators just on their own wouldn't be sufficient for us to be like, oh my gosh, I think this is a situation of human trafficking. But once you put it all together, you realize, oh, this just doesn't seem right. There's just something about this that's just a little bit off. And there's just something about this that makes me think, I'm not sure. And so, for example, it could be, you know, a demeanor. It could be when somebody is really withdrawn. So, for example, with young people, sometimes we see this, you know, somebody's behavior has changed over time. They might have been a little bit more outgoing, a little bit more social with their friend groups, but in that luring process or in that grooming process, when somebody else is trying to control you or manipulate you, that autonomy is taken away. So they might become more withdrawn. They might become more isolated from their friends. If their body, you know, that indication that somebody's controlling them. It could be also physical signs of abuse. Now, sometimes there is physical signs, but again, traffickers are aware that you don't, if somebody walks in and is walking around the street and they got a black eye, people are going to start to pay attention to that. And so a lot of times that abuse might be masked, right? So again, back to those behaviors, there can also be a lack of belongings.
Right.
So here's a great example of a situation where somebody was in a forced labor scenario, but they were working at a place like at a factory where there were several other people with legitimate jobs and contracts. But what was interesting with this situation is one of the other employees noticed that this particular person was getting dropped off really early and picked up, but they also were not ever having lunch with the group. Now, when you would see that, somebody not having lunch on a once-off basis, oh yeah, okay, that's not a big deal. But then consistently never bringing packed lunch, never bringing their own personal belongings, always getting dropped off and picked up, always being isolated from everybody else. These were some of the indicators that combined, they noticed something's not right and were able to make, call the helpline, give this information. It kind of comes like as a tip that then goes, all right, we're going to investigate this. And sure enough, even though that person, had a legitimate contract and everything, behind the scenes, there was somebody who was controlling them. And so they weren't ever receiving that paycheck. They were never able to come and go freely. So those are some of the different indicators that we see. Again, that can be, like that, like I said before, a lack of belongings or identification. If they don't speak the language, sometimes you can wonder, everyone, when you get a job, you tend to have to go through an interview process.
Right.
More countries, it's a legal requirement for you to be able to speak the language or write the language or be able to, sign. Before you can sign something, you would have to agree to that. So imagine being in a situation where somebody is working and they don't even speak the language. These things can become indicators that we look for.
Okay. And Dorothy, how does A21 come into it? How does A21 help out?
Yeah, so you said briefly at the beginning, for example, I am the reach coordinator. So we have this 3R approach essentially. And so within the cycle of victimization, what we see is that essentially it's somebody's vulnerability that leads them to being exploited and taken advantage of. We saw that in the story of Laura. We see that when potentially, if a job shortage or, in countries where there is civil unrest or war, right now we've seen these different things taking place, even with everything that's going on in the Ukraine. And so all of these things heighten someone's vulnerability and their needs. So that leads to vulnerability leads to someone being exploited. And then within that exploitation, more times than not, people become victimized. And so our method and our approach is to intercept those three different points, that cycle of re-victimization. So the first way that we do that is through reach. So reach is all about awareness, education, and how can we be on the prevention side of things? How, like this conversation right now is a perfect example of how we want people to not necessarily walk around with fear, but to be aware that this is happening in plain sight. Right. It's happening to anybody and everyone per se. It's not just one specific group of people in a specific part of the world. Sadly, it's happening in every country across the world. And so awareness, we believe, is the key to prevention, to safeguarding. Sadly, especially in light of COVID, we've seen an increase in online exploitation. And so we know that people are not just susceptible in the outside spaces, they're also susceptible in their homes, because we all have more people than not. We all have a phone. We have this technology in the palm of our hand that also allows us to connect with people all over the world, which is amazing, but also makes us vulnerable in another way that now it's like, oh, how do we bring more safeguarding when you're in the safety and the comfort of your home? Well, we need to be able to have those conversations. We work all the way from primary age school, so young children who could be targeted through gaming, through different social media apps, all these different things, all the way up into, high school, to universities and our general public, especially within jobs and recruitment. And our goal is to make someone aware that this is happening, but also here are some of the indicators. Here are some of the things that if you suspect something and it seems too good to be true, more times than not, it is. So you can make a phone call, you can call the modern slavery helpline. It's all anonymous. You can look up on our website to see just like, all right, is this possibly a situation that I should be careful? You can start a conversation with a teacher, with an adult, with a parent, somebody message, I'm not sure if it's a safe person or not. And having the language around it, I think, is the first step. And then second, for people who are in the situation where they are being exploited, we intercept that space with our rescue team. And so that looks like, in some situations, being part of investigations and raids. Like early on when we started as an organization nearly 15 years ago, we started in Greece. And so a lot of our operations looked like, potentially going into brothels and then helping women who had been rescued, and then also helping them within that rehabilitation process, helping law enforcement, border force training. We work very much within this collaboration and partnership space, so that people who are on the front lines, who are engaging with individuals day in, day out, they know what to spot and look for.
Right.
Even like front professionals like yourself in the healthcare system. I have people on my, for example, that they work specifically with social workers, with medical professionals, because a lot of times a potential victim of human trafficking might go through those services before they would get to us. And
That's
so
right.
we're the experts, but we want to be resourcing and supporting people in their everyday world so that they can spot the indicators and know how to respond. And then lastly is our restore. So that's the last R, is restore. And so sadly, the majority of victims of human trafficking will fall back into the cycle of victimization unless there's direct intervention, unless there's support systems. So perhaps you and I, yes, we have vulnerabilities, but we have a network. For example, if I was to lose my job next week, I have a family that I know I could kind of fall back on, who would support me in that process of getting a new job. If I needed to move back home, I could do that. But for a lot of people, they, not of their own choosing, might be isolated, might not have family members, might not have people that they trust and can rely on. And so they don't know where to turn. And so we want to make sure that we have, affordable housing, that we have training for them, whether it's finishing schooling or getting into, other secondary or certificate programs, so that they can have their freedom and independence. And we work alongside, again, psychologists and professionals, so that that individual gets the need and the support that's necessary for their freedom.
That's great. So you there during the whole voyage, which is really, really important.
Yeah, and it's pretty much like a holistic approach. We don't want to just meet one area. We want to make sure that we're meeting all the vulnerable points so that we can prevent that cycle from continuing.
And it's amazing. A21 really, I really am a great fan, because when I get all the news, when I get the news of yet another person was rescued, yet another person has begun to live again, and it's really so good. So we really thank you for your work. But now I can also think that all this has a lot of costs. How do you get funded? How?
Yeah, so we work as an NGO, so a non-governmental organization, and we work in that capacity for the specific reason that we want to be able to help everyone and anyone. And so, like, our mission statement is to abolish slavery everywhere, forever. And obviously that's a big mission statement, that's a big goal. And so in order to do that, we rely heavily on partnerships. And so we operate as a charity where people make donations. We have charitable partnerships with other organizations. We apply for grants and funding and in all sorts of ways, but very much it is through the support of everyday people that are contributing to this organization, which is amazing. So like I said earlier, 12 years ago, when I first heard about A21, it was like, well, how can I be part of the solution? And the reality is very few of us in our lifetime are going to potentially be in a role like this, or being a safeguarding situation. And it's not about, wearing a cape and being a superhero and going in and rescuing people. That's on the very rare side of things. But first thing is awareness that can lead to prevention, starting the conversation, sharing with other people, sharing on our socials. And then the second thing is financial contribution, because we have seen, like you said, the impact of now, after all these years, thousands of people being safeguarded. And so that's been something that has been, I think, remarkable over this time period.
That's great. Where do you have, whereabouts do you have your rehab centers? Is it in different countries, or is it spread out in the world?
Yeah, so we work in several different countries. We work in approximately, we are in 18 different locations across 15 different countries. And so it's very much a contextual approach depending on what is the need there. For some locations, for example, like in our Thailand, Cambodia area, we have very much this rehabilitation set up there. For example, in the UK, we primarily work in the reach and rescue area, and then we partner with shelters. Because there's that resource there, we're not here to reinvent the wheel for anyone, we're here to support that. And so we work alongside other organizations.
Hi, we just had a quick pause because Dorothy had to change rooms, but here we are again. And Dorothy, I was asking you, why the name A21?
So A21 stands for Abolishing Human Trafficking or Modern Slavery in the 21st Century.
Right.
Yeah, when our founder started, I think this story I really love. It's kind of incredible. When she first heard about human trafficking, she was in a trip in Greece. She was going through the airport in, I think it was Thessaloniki, and there was a bunch of posters of missing, women and children and men. And they were walking through this airport, and the person that was like their host, she turned to them and asked, like, I don't understand why there's so many faces of these missing people. To which they said, oh, these are the alleged victims of human trafficking. Now, again, this is over 15 years ago, so you can imagine this was not it wasn't a very common term. There wasn't a lot of understanding around it. And it was very much a notion that there's nothing you can do. And so she kind of went into this, like, this is mad. And there was this one image, this girl that she saw, a young girl, her name was Sophia, and that's the same name as her daughter. And, is that realization, like, this could be my child. What's the difference between this young child that is missing, that it's being exploited and abused, versus my own child? And so very much A21 is kind of fueled by this idea of this radical hope that if it was for one person, we would do anything, it would be worth it to rescue that person so that they could have the opportunity of a life, free from harm, but also to have, a full future. And so that's kind of how it started out. And very much people early on in the initial setting was like, you can't do it, the issue's too big. In Greece, they were like, you're just a woman, like this issue is just too big for anybody. And so again, there was a lot of that, like, that tenacity to be like, no, we're going to do whatever we can. And so early on, people were like, well, what are you going to call yourselves? And our founder was like, well, I don't know, like, what's our mission? Like, we want to see the end, abolish slavery everywhere forever, or the 21st century. So that's kind of how the name came about. And now we go by A21. Oversee
And you actually get calls from police also, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we work, we oversee 3 different hotlines or helplines. So the South Africa one, there's one in Spain as well. And then we've got a team in Bulgaria. So we work alongside, in other countries, we also partner with some of these different helplines. But for example, with our South Africa team, very much, there is this point of reference, or there's a lot of partnership with law enforcement, with border force, or with, medical professionals, social workers, all these things. And so it's very much a collaborative process. And thankfully, that's, I think, been part of the success of seeing people rescued, as well as we work, within a legal team as well to help make sure that traffickers are being prosecuted, and there's sufficient evidence for that case to go forward, and for there to be, a sentencing and a prosecution. Because sadly, early on, they're some countries didn't necessarily have sufficient laws around modern slavery or trafficking. Now there is a lot more, but then there wasn't sufficient evidence. And so we needed to work alongside victims so that they could be able to testify, so that that trafficker would then be able to be imprisoned and not continue doing these crimes. And so it is very much a partnership in the way that we work to make sure that we are tackling this issue from all these different points.
Right. And I can imagine that sometimes the victims themselves can be scared of calling in case they have to remain in the same place. And I'd like to ask you, is the rescue immediate?
It depends on the situation. So, for example, we always tell people that if there is an immediate emergency, to call authorities right away. Whereas if we were to see a situation where there might be some of these indicators that we talked about, you might see somebody that's showing some of this, like being controlled by another person, or signs of emotional distress or abuse or neglect or missing belongings, or, you know, there could be a lot of these different indicators, but you haven't witnessed an actual crime per se. We would say call the helpline. It's anonymous. Your information is not necessarily going to be kept, but and this has actually been the case in some of these different countries that we oversee the helpline, where we had a situation where law enforcement contacted one of these hotlines and said, we have this person, but we don't have enough evidence for them to be like sentenced. Do you have anything? Sure enough, they went onto their information, and that license plate number that was attached to that specific person, they had all these different calls and tips that were associated to that license plate, able to pass that over to the authorities, and that contributed to that person being denied bail and not being automatically let out. And so to help build that case. So here's an example where you think, oh, I'm just making an anonymous tip. Who knows if it's even going to be helpful? Well, potentially it could, either immediately or maybe down the line in these different points.
Right. Do you have any number of people, or less, if you remember, how many people A21 has helped?
To be fair, it's a bit tricky when it comes to like a specific number. Like, obviously we get yearly statistics in the sense of like who we have been able to help in different capacities. I don't think I would be able to tell you just off the top of my head in total. It's one thing that's also remarkable is, given, for example, like, so say with a case or a situation where somebody is being sentenced, some of these court cases that are being won could be taking place over years. You know, so this year we've seen several court cases being won, which is amazing, but that could have been over a long period of time. Same with like some of the rescuing, depending on the context and the location. But even within, like, say, our prevention space, we run a lot of campaigns. So one of our campaigns, for example, is called Can You See Me? And so this campaign started here in the UK specifically, and it's an awareness, basically these different images or short clips of common trafficking scenarios. And the idea of asking this question, because again, it's hidden in plain sight, it's happening all around us. And more times than not, you know, we just kind of become almost desensitized to these things and don't realize that potentially someone is in a vulnerable situation and being taken advantage of or exploited. And so we have them across a lot of our airports. Was running in the tube, for example, and all these different countries, these billboards and these presentations set up. And so, you know, thousands of people, you know, have been able to cross paths and see one of these posters, see the helpline. We've heard stories of people, because of seeing one of those posters, made a phone call, an anonymous tip, that was then the direct impact to having, I'm thinking of this one story of a young girl who was on a flight, wasn't sure, it could have been, you know, a father-daughter situation, or it could have been a trafficking thing, but there was enough indicators for this other passenger to go, this just seems like her behavior just doesn't seem right. This just doesn't seem like a safe situation, called, and sure enough, this young girl was being trafficked, and they were able to intercept. So on the one side, we see a lot of the prevention, and we don't necessarily know the total number that we've impacted, but we know that a lot of these things are contributing in a positive way.
Oh, that's great. And should anyone be listening to us and themselves being a victim of human trafficking or slavery, do you have any word for them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest things that I would say to anybody who finds themselves in a situation that they don't want to be in to begin with, or feel like they can't escape, and it's almost the problems become too big to even know what's your first step. I would first of all say to them that, like, there's no shame. What someone has done to you or what has taken place doesn't get to define you, and that you still have the opportunity to have a life full of freedom and impact, and you can dream again. And that even if you find yourself in a situation where you feel powerless, that there are people who are here to help and support you and believe in you, and there are people who are trustworthy out there that you can rely on. And I think, I would never want to assume that I would understand how someone might feel, but even being victimized or taken advantage of, you are not a victim, you're a survivor. The fact that you have breath in your lungs, you're a survivor. And this is, perhaps the day that you go, here's the day that I'm going to, look for the opportunity to get out of this or seek help, and know that I'm not going to be alone. I'm not going to necessarily, there's opportunity for me to get out, and that's what I would probably say to someone.
That's great. Thank you, Dorothy. It's been such a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for bringing more and more awareness. It's so important. I mean, I can't. I think we would have, we could talk during so many hours. So I hope to have you again soon.
Yes, definitely.
And for anyone that's listening to us, and should you feel that you should make this call, please do it. There's going to be different numbers that you can choose from. So make that call. There will be someone ready to listen to you and to help you out. And may we all really be aware, much more aware than we really are now, and ready to see the people around us. Thank you. And if you haven't yet subscribed to this channel, please feel free to do so so that you don't lose any content. Bye for now.